Kindly note that the views and opinions shared in this video are those of the speaker and do not constitute advice given by Classic Private Wealth. Any advice given by Classic Private Wealth will be in writing in the form of a wealth management proposal. Classic Private Wealth is an authorized financial services provider.
Having said that, the topic we chose for today is South African politics, just because I've been having many questions over the last 2 weeks, actually a little bit longer, from people saying they are extremely worried about what's happening in politics in South Africa and what is our opinion. And the way we think about politics is not really to think about what we would like to happen or what party we support or what person we support. What we try to do is to be completely objective, as objective as possible, as they would say, and to say that we actually analyze what's happening and what the likely consequences are for our clients. And that's not only from an investment point of view, because South African politics has a massive influence not only on our clients' investments, but on their whole lives, their businesses, their education, their medical care, etc., etc. So politics actually really important for the whole lives of our clients. And given the holistic nature of the advice we give, we think taking politics into account is really important, but not in an emotional way of being angry or being upset or being euphoric, but by taking an objective view of where politics is going. And you can't actually think about South African politics without starting with Cyril Ramaphosa, given that he is currently the president of the country and actually a major player in South African politics for a very long period of time. So those of you who are getting the picture should be seeing Nelson Mandela and a young Cyril Ramaphosa. Cyril seemed to have anticipated the beard fashion, so he's not wearing a beard now, but he did wear a beard then. So he was before his time again. And what we've got to say about Cyril is that it's interesting to just think about his origins. Not many people know that Cyril is a committed Catholic. So his involvement in politics really comes from his involvement through the church in charitable organizations. He then moved on to a black consciousness labor movement. Eventually was convinced that black consciousness is not the way forward, but non-racialism is the way forward, and actually started the NUM and joined COSATU, which always have had a strong alliance with the South African Communist Party. So you can trace all the various things: religion, black consciousness, socialism, communism, all of those exist in his background. And the one thing that we hold over from all of that is that Cyril, from his early days in the unions, and we've spoken to some people who were involved with Cyril in the early days, he has always been very strict on corruption. He doesn't like stealing, he doesn't like corruption, and he's personally extremely honest. So a person with an aversion to dishonesty and corruption, but also a person to be reckoned with. If you were a young black guy taking on Anglo-American in the late 70s and early 80s, throughout the 80s actually starting the NUM, it means that you were certainly a person to be reckoned with, not something that was easy to do or which just had a smooth career without any opposition. So by the time that 1994 came around, Cyril was a very prominent person in the, let's say, ANC alliance, and he was the clear successor, identified successor to Nelson Mandela originally. And for those of you who were around at the time, and I guess that's most of the people on this conference call, I see that Lee spoke about experience. It's another word for age, I guess. The whole idea of what happens when Mandela goes, which was prominent in South African politics for a long time, only arose once Thabo Mbeki took over as the second in charge to Mandela. While Cyril was in charge, everybody had great confidence in Cyril. The one thing I'd like to point out from that era, apart from Cyril's close involvement in the negotiations and the fact that he was an extremely hard and able negotiator, was Cyril's preference for sufficient consensus. Now, that's a word that many young South Africans won't recognize, but the whole negotiation process was driven by the concept of sufficient consensus, and that's very much something from Cyril's background and that Cyril has been promoting, and that is the idea that in politics you should be taking everyone along. You don't actually just try to be the dominant party and therefore suppress everybody else. You get everybody else to buy into your project and you take them all along. And the idea behind sufficient consensus then is you do nothing that is so offensive to any of your partners that they can't support your project. So the whole CODESA project was very successful. And in that process, they basically took everyone from conservative Afrikaners to communists, etc. They got everybody involved. They got everybody to accept the legitimacy of the process. And that was very much driven by Cyril. So Cyril was a person to be reckoned with decades ago. Then the next step for Cyril is that he loses out on becoming the next leader of the ANC. And the story there goes that Cyril was actually extremely confident that he would be Mandela's successor. He was certainly, in Mandela's eyes, the preferred successor. But one of the things that we've learned about the ANC over the years is that the ANC doesn't easily fall into the thrall of one person, meaning you need to be very careful. If you think that the whole ANC is just going to fall in line behind one person, it's extremely unlikely to happen. So the ANC has many factions in it, and those factions don't necessarily fall in line behind one specific leader. Even Mandela was not able to dictate who his successor should be. And Cyril, in the process of running the negotiations, fell foul of two people in the ANC. The one was Winnie Mandela and the other was Peter Mokaba. So when the time came to elect Mandela's successor, Mokaba and Winnie Mandela both threw their weight behind Thabo Mbeki rather than behind Cyril Ramaphosa. And that is why Thabo Mbeki became the deputy or the vice president of the ANC and eventually the deputy president of South Africa from 1994 onwards and the president from 1999 onwards. So it was obviously a great personal disappointment to Cyril to be passed over as the next leader. And Cyril essentially exited politics and concentrated on business, but he never exited the NEC, the National Executive Committee of the ANC. So Cyril, although he wasn't a member of cabinet, always remained an influential person in the ANC throughout the period after he was sidelined. But I think that event of being sidelined because he had been overconfident had a lasting impact on his attitude at a later stage. So what we see is that Cyril's perception became that he should be very patient and wait his turn, and he will eventually become the president. And the idea that you should be very vocal about your opinions and that you should push your own opinions throughout certainly lost a lot of appeal for Cyril. So Cyril was a low-profile participant from that point forward until he became, in fact, the president. So even when Cyril became the deputy president in 2014, he was still a low-profile participant for a deputy president. And in essence, what he did is to say, better for me to wait until I am the president and then to implement my opinions than to be too opinionated at an early stage. So patience and forbearance has been the hallmark of Cyril's participation in the ANC since roughly 1994 onwards, I guess. What that also means is that we're not always 100% clear on all of Cyril's own opinions. So a lot of people have various opinions about what Cyril's real agenda is, but it's not always clear because he keeps his opinions to himself. He doesn't necessarily voice strong opinions. Which brings me to the point at which Cyril became the president of the ANC. What we've got to say at this stage is there was a period, and it already started to some extent under Thabo Mbeki when he was the president from 1999 onwards. Thabo Mbeki very much had the opinion that it's better to have someone that is politically on side in charge of something than to have someone who is competent in charge of something. So we see the start of the appointment of people who are politically and often racially the correct person being appointed to various places, firstly in politics, but secondly also in places like state-owned enterprises, who are not necessarily selected for their competence, but more selected for their political alignment with the president. And this tendency accelerated once Jacob Zuma became the president. And whereas Mbeki was certainly someone who liked power and who wanted to stay in charge, I think that he basically overplayed his hand, and that is why Jacob Zuma was able to sideline him within the ANC. He thought that he had the ANC under control, Mbeki, but it clearly wasn't the case. That's why Jacob Zuma was eventually elected as his successor, and he was sidelined. But once Zuma came to power, we really actually saw the populist wing of the ANC becoming very influential. So this populist wing of the ANC, first of all, what happened is that Zuma, to a large extent, were prepared to make compromises in terms of things like economic policy, as long as he could appoint his buddies to the various places where there was money to be siphoned off. And the interesting thing is money is then siphoned off under the rubric of radical economic transformation. But the radical economic transformation that we see is really driven by allowing some people from India, the Guptas, to harvest large profits through state capture. So we see the whole state capture project as being the central plank of the Zuma presidency. Now, that wasn't as obvious in the first years of the Zuma presidency. It only became obvious during his second term, and it only became obvious once the Zondo Commission was established. So most of what we now know about state capture only came to the fore after Zuma exited. But effectively, we see a real populist project playing out in South Africa. Now, if we want to have a look at populist projects, the best example we have of the ultimate consequences of these populist projects is Venezuela. So in Venezuela, we had the election of a firebrand populist to the presidency under Hugo Chavez. And Chavez then did two things immediately. The one thing he did was to expand the civil service and the employment by state-owned enterprises. So a much larger civil service with very comfortable salaries, much larger employment by state-owned enterprises in order to consolidate his power base with the ordinary people. But then the second leg of that was to send his buddies to the country's largest energy producer in Venezuela. That happened to be one of the world's biggest oil companies, Venezuela being a large oil producer. And the consequence of that was, first of all, that Chavez and his buddies started stealing large amounts of money. But the second consequence was that the oil company was run so badly that it eventually couldn't produce a lot of oil anymore because they were appointed for their participation in the stealing project and not for their competence at producing oil. And then once that whole section had been exhausted, once there was nothing left in the oil company, the next part of the project was to start printing money. So effectively, in order to maintain the wages that was being paid to the expanded civil service, the central bank in Venezuela started printing money, and that eventually led to a massive depreciation of the currency and hyperinflation, which we are still seeing. And so a very bad consequence for the economy as a whole. But what we also need to understand about these projects is eventually when you get this hyperinflation and this massive depreciation of the currency, they force all currency transactions into the central bank, and they then allocate forex to their buddies at preferential prices. So there's typically some kind of official rate, which is very unrealistic, but everybody who's a buddy of the president gets forex at that preferential rate, and everybody else has to deal at the massively depreciated black market rate. So that's roughly how that project works. In South Africa, we saw the first phase of that project under Zuma, meaning Zuma sent his buddies to the country's largest energy producing company in South Africa. That's electricity, so not oil. So we saw Eskom being the core of the state capture project, but also other state-owned enterprises such as SAA, SABC, etc., came into the firing line for this. But there was also a significantly expanded civil service and massive expansion of employment by state-owned enterprises. So actually something that looks very similar to the Venezuelan situation, except that before the final scene of this state capture / populist project could play out, Zuma was deselected and Cyril Ramaphosa was elected to be the new president. The other thing that happened during the Zuma presidency is the rise of the so-called Premier League. So at the secondary level, meaning in the provinces, there was a number of premiers who were very much on board with the populist project. And these are typically the provinces where there's a large number of grant recipients and civil servants rather than a large private sector economy. So you can see Mpumalanga, Northwest, and the Free State being the three provinces involved. And actually, the most interesting of those is a person called Didi Mabuza there at the center of your picture. What Mabuza did is he was very involved in a variety of provincially financed projects, but he channeled this money not into his personal coffers, but into the coffers of the provincial ANC, and he made sure that he recruited a massive number of new members for the ANC, which meant that Mpumalanga's heft in the election of the next ANC president was out of proportion with the size and influence of the province in South Africa. So Mabuza basically built himself a very strong political base. And for reasons that are not 100% clear yet, Mabuza eventually decided that he will not throw his weight behind Dlamini Zuma at the next ANC conference, and that he would throw his weight behind Cyril Ramaphosa. So what we find is that Cyril, having stayed very quiet during the whole state capture project and having been deputy president through at least half of it, and staying very quiet and subdued during this period, was eventually elected as the president of the ANC, but not with his own slate being victorious. And the interesting thought there was, it looks like the voting inside the ANC is not 100% reliable, in the sense that if you counted up all the branches, there was a clear majority for Cyril and his slate at the branch level. But once they got to the conference, voting didn't actually follow the branch level votes. So eventually you see Cyril being elected, but with deputies that he would not have chosen for himself. So anybody who saw Cyril Ramaphosa's face when Didi Mabuza was announced as the deputy president of the ANC will know that he's in an extremely uncomfortable position. So there you can see quite an uncomfortable Cyril sitting between Ace Magashule, now the Secretary General of the ANC, and Didi Mabuza, the Deputy President of the ANC and the Deputy President of the country. So what we're seeing is that Cyril is in a very unenviable position. So even though he's become the president, he's not fully in charge. And this becomes quite an important issue. So what we see is that on the National Executive Committee, 40 people chosen at the ANC conference, those 40 people are effectively the interim government of the country, because this is the committee that can appoint or recall ANC deployee, including the president. So when both Thabo Mbeki and Jacob Zuma were removed from the presidency, they were undeployed by the NEC. So the NEC is an extremely important matter, and effectively Cyril governs with the permission of the NEC. And the feedback we have at this point, and there's no reason to doubt it, is that there are three factions within the NEC. So there is the Cyril faction, Cyril supporters, so people like Peter Mboweni, for instance, who are part of the, let's just say, realistic and market-orientated wing of the ANC. Then you have another faction, which is the Premier League faction, also known as the Radical Economic Transformation faction or the State Capture faction, pretty much led by Ace Magashule as the head of the organization of the ANC. And then you have a third branch or faction, and that third faction is the COSATU/Communist Party alliance. Now, it's interesting that COSATU and the Communist Party, although they are economically on the side of people who are in the who would like to have more government control, they are very set against corruption. So the whole state capture and Gupta issue was not to the satisfaction of the COSATU Communist Party alliance. So it's interesting that there's a split there as well. But effectively, the Communist Party COSATU representatives are now the swing vote within the NEC. So what you will see is that Cyril can basically push his own agenda as long as he does not affront the COSATU Communist Party alliance. So what you will often see is that there will be a new plan announced for Eskom, for instance, which says that we will reduce Eskom's employees by a third. And then the next day, Pravin Gordhan, as Minister of Government of State-Owned Enterprises, will come out and say it's a very good plan, except we're not going to retrench anybody, because they are not in a position to offend the interests of COSATU, which is very much a civil servant trade union these days, because they've lost the mining side to AMCU, but they are still very much the teachers and the nurses, etc., are very much on the COSATU side, so they are still extremely influential. So a lot of what you've seen really is driven by that balance that needs to be maintained within the NEC. So ultimately, if you're thinking about who's in charge of South Africa right now, actually the NEC is pretty much who's in charge, even though the Command Council would also want to put up its hand. Actually, everything that happens is driven through the NEC. And part of what we see is that it's clear that the state capture faction, as I like to call it, has not given up. So what you see is that a lot of people, even though Cyril Ramaphosa is the president and therefore able to appoint people, he's not able to appoint people at his leisure and at his pleasure, because he still has to have the NEC behind him, which means that Ace Magashule has been able to make speeches to his supporters that says, don't worry, in 3 years' time there's another election and we will come back into power. So don't fall in line behind Cyril. We're still the stronger party. And it may very well be that the state capture faction actually has more support within the ANC, NEC, but they just didn't have a very good candidate in the presidential election. So one of the things that we learn about populism worldwide is that if you don't have a good candidate, you will often lose the election. So even though Donald Trump wasn't very popular, Hillary Clinton was not a very good candidate, and therefore Donald Trump won out. And in this case, Dlamini Zuma probably wasn't a very good candidate. So as you see in her appearances now with the lockdown, not a charismatic speaker or a front person, Dlamini Zuma, but and therefore lost out to Cyril. The fact that Cyril was then elected as president of the ANC actually interrupted something else. And that something else is the move towards the coalition government that was intended by the writers of the South African Constitution. So I'm moving on to a slightly different subject, and that slightly different subject is the future of politics in South Africa. So what happened is that during Zuma's second term, the ANC started losing a lot of popularity because of the fact that the whole state capture thing was coming to the fore, and also economic stagnation, because large companies were seeing that it was no longer a friendly environment for business, neither friendly nor fair, I guess. They were being forced into all kinds of contracts with the Guptas, etc. So what happened is that the ANC started losing popularity, and the DA was moving beyond their original white base towards a more black orientated leadership. So you see Musi Maimane becoming the leader of the ANC, and you see someone like Herman Mashaba becoming their candidate in Joburg for local elections. So what we see in 2017 is that the ANC actually loses control of a number of the big metros. So Tshwane, Johannesburg, PE joins Cape Town as non-ANC cities. And what you're seeing is that there has to be some form of alliance. Now, if we go back to the South African Constitution, the South African Constitution is a proportional representation constitution. Now, proportional representation is supposed to be a system whereby no one party has the ultimate majority and where the governing party is forced to ally with other smaller parties in order to govern. So if you look at Europe, Germany, Holland, etc., you see those coalition governments over long periods of time. And those coalition governments actually force some form of compromise, which means that it's less easy to have a radical solution in politics. So first past the post voting systems like the Westminster system in Britain allows one person to have a very strong influence on what's happening. But in a coalition government, that's not possible. So when Cyril got elected, the first thing that happened is that a lot of potential DA voters actually went back to the ANC and voted for the ANC again. So the ANC in the national elections in 2019 got 54% of the vote again. And that is to a very large extent because ordinary people in South Africa like Cyril Ramaphosa quite a lot, and they liked his the perception they had that he would have a clean administration and that he would be good for the economy. The problem, of course, is that the Ramaphoria of the early days of Cyril as president has given way to Ramasauria, meaning there's been great disappointment at the fact that Cyril has not been able to impose his will. And again, there's a lot of doubt about what Cyril's ultimate own opinion is. So, for instance, on a very important issue such as the whole question of land redistribution, it's very doubtful that Cyril really supports the idea that you shouldn't compensate people where you take their land. But he's forced to actually fall in line behind the resolutions taken by the ANC Congress in order to stay in charge. But he's not 100% sure. Maybe he actually does support that idea. It's not clear from his statements. Another thing that's not clear is the whole question of national health insurance. Is that something that Cyril personally supports, or is it something that he falls in line with his more radical colleagues because he doesn't win the argument in the NEC? Not 100% clear. But what is 100% clear is that Cyril is not clearly in charge, and it's very likely then that either if Cyril is removed by the ANC, which is always a possibility, that he loses out on the next round of voting inside the ANC, or if he's clearly not in charge and the voting goes the other way, we actually get into a situation where after the next election in 2024, we actually end up with coalition politics, meaning the ANC doesn't get a clear majority and it has to turn to another party for an ally. And what quite possibly happens in such a situation is that the ANC breaks up into its two wings, meaning the state capture wing, if you like, and the more liberal wing. So let's just call it the Tito Mboweni wing of the ANC. So what you then see is that there are two potential allies for the ANC. The one ally is the DA, which would be an unacceptable ally probably to the more radical wing of the ANC. And the other potential ally is the EFF. So Julius Malema is working himself into a position where if coalition politics becomes the rule of the day in South Africa, he would be an extremely attractive ally. And in the era of Zuma, it was even possible for the EFF and the DA to ally with each other, but they are clearly not natural allies ideologically in the future. It's only because they had a common enemy and they wanted to govern that they were able to become in charge. And really that experiment in coalition between the DA and the EFF, not a great success. So that's the state of play. And what you then see is that it's quite possible that we get an alliance between Julius Malema and Ace Magashule becoming the next government. Now that's a scary thought if you've ever given if you're given to nightmares. That's a real nightmare situation for South Africa. At the same time, of course, we get the implosion of the DA in the sense that the whole project. So the whole project of getting black leaders and starting to gain black support, there seems to be no appetite for that left in the DA. The DA also lost a lot of support to the Freedom Front Plus in the last national election. So instead of Mmusi Maimane and Herman Mashaba, we see Helen Zille and John Steenhuisen being the face of the DA. So basically, back to consolidating their white liberal support rather than trying to gain massive support from black people. Now, again, if we now move on to what's happened in the lockdown, what have we learned from the lockdown? Now, again, I'm not going to get into the arguments about whether the lockdown was a good or a bad idea. I'm focusing on what the political fallout has been. So the face of the lockdown actually turns out to be not Cyril Ramaphosa, but Dlamini Zuma, his opponent in terms of the ANC election, who in fact apparently works closely with Zuma and they have a good personal relationship. So in terms of both Dlamini Zuma and Ramaphosa, both of them have tried to not be associated with one faction, but to rather be unifying. And effectively, the whole lockdown project is being driven by Dlamini Zuma as a doctor and a previous Minister of Health, and also the coordinator for local government. So she seems to be the face of what's happening. Now, what have we learned during the lockdown? So the first thing is that Cyril is quite a charismatic leader, and he kicked off the whole lockdown with a very serious demeanor, and I think that he gathered a lot of support for his position. A lot of people took him at his word that he had their interest at heart when the lockdown initially started. But as the lockdown is wearing on, Cyril seems to be losing his punch. So effectively, his last appearance on TV, where he apologized for getting things wrong, but didn't actually announce any of the things that should be replacing those mistakes. He was significantly less impressive. It's also clear and it's I think that an incident that has cost him a lot of support is the whole question of cigarettes being allowed under level 4 and then the next day being disallowed by Dlamini Zuma, and so it seemingly being overridden by his ministers has cost him a lot of support. So Cyril is not coming out of this with smelling of roses from a political point of view. It seems like he's losing ground to his more radical ministers. The second thing that we learned from the lockdown is that there is a great deal of incompetence in the South African government. So you hear a beautiful speech by Cyril Ramaphosa, and the next day you hear completely irrational announcements like we will have exercise between 6 o'clock and 9 o'clock in the morning and not through the rest of the day. Now that makes absolutely no sense whatsoever. So it's a case of pure incompetence. The other question is we are now banning cigarettes and liquor during our lockdown. Now we are the only country in the world that are banning there's no other country in the world that even bans one of those two things. So there's absolutely no reason to think that it's rational to ban those two things. In fact, if you're living in a country where gangs are already a problem, you should know that you're opening the door to the gangsters by banning those two items. So I've not encountered anyone that I know who smokes who have stopped smoking during this lockdown. They just source their cigarettes from the gangsters. So they are legitimizing the gangsters. So complete incompetence that we see in the government. And it really is, there's a small layer of competence between Mkhize and Ramaphosa. And then as soon as it passes into the rest of the cabinet and the government, there is complete incompetence. So the incompetence of the South African government is on glaring display. The other thing that is then quite clear is that there is a very strong authoritarian tendency in the South African government. So at the least provocation, they establish things like command councils. Now, a command council is something that actually has a very authoritarian flavor to it. And in fact, it's not clear even who the command council is. That is not for the public to know. The best information we have is that it's now the whole cabinet and all directors general are part of the command council. So it seems to be a large and unwieldy instrument. But it's also clear that Cyril's not in charge at that command council. That is why he comes out with generalities and doesn't get involved in the specifics. He's the face of the government, but really not in charge. So with that, then, what is the consequences of all of this? So my first thought would be, what was Cyril's plan before the lockdown happened? Cyril's plan, in my view, was never that he would forever govern shackled by the Premier League and his opponents from the state capture movement. His plan has always been that he would allow the law to take its course and for a lot of these people to be removed because of their criminal activity. The problem that we encountered, of course, is that the National Prosecuting Authority had been devastated under the state capture project, and therefore he had to reconstitute the National Prosecuting Authority, appoint a new head of that prosecuting authority, and allow that prosecuting authority to start from scratch, building cases against state capture participants. Now, the way that these prosecutions normally work worldwide, would also have seen it in America in the Trump environment. The first thing you do is you go after the middle level officials, and once you've got them guilty, you get them to turn to become state witnesses against the real culprits. So what you're seeing in these state capture prosecutions is pretty much that they are likely to go after mid-level participants first and then move up to start prosecuting people like Ace Magashule, for instance, where there's plenty of reasons to think that there were untoward actions when he was the president of the, or the governor of, or the premier of the Free State, and Momopelo, who was also regarded as quite a corrupt person in Northwest, and so on and so on. Even Mabuza may be someone who would be vulnerable to that type of thing. So I think that Cyril's idea was that he would sideline most of these state capturers and actually have a second term as president with his own slate of people, his own NEC that he can dominate, and where he can then implement his vision for South Africa. So what you would say is it is still the patient Cyril. The idea that he's just a puppet for other people and that he has no agenda of his own, I find extremely hard to give credence to. But what we see is that clearly at this point he's not in charge, and the thing that I would say about a situation like the whole lockdown and the epidemic that we are facing is that it makes much more radical outcomes possible than was possible before. So what happened in the normal course of things is that you would get a small tilt to one side and then a small tilt to the other side, and things kind of muddle through not very far from the middle. In a radical situation like the current one, where we see unemployment like we've never seen before, we see contractions in the economy like we've never seen before, we see isolation from the rest of the world like we've never seen before, because all countries are really attending to themselves in this environment and not worrying too much about what's happening elsewhere. The possibility of radical outcomes in South Africa becomes a lot more likely. Now, what are the radical potential outcomes? The one radical potential outcome is that Cyril takes this opportunity to sideline his opponents. So if you listen to his pronouncements, he's saying long before anyone else in the world, Cyril was already saying that we need a new deal for the economy after this lockdown. And part of this new deal is that we should have a complete reformulation of state-owned enterprises. So one of the big struggles of Cyril's presidency so far has been to try to reform the state-owned enterprises. And that clearly has not been very easy, because the rot that set in there was very deep. So SAA, it's not yet clear what the outcome will be, but I guess the fact that all airlines in the world is now bankrupt is a step towards reforming SAA. The feedback we're getting is that Eskom is still in dire trouble, but at least we've got someone who was appointed for his competency rather than for his politics as the head of Eskom. But there's a lot more radical outcomes now possible in this environment. And it's also possible that Cyril gets sidelined and that the state capture project basically gets back on track, and that we see a much more radical economic transformation where BEE is pushed to a much larger level, and we go back to political and race-based appointments rather than appointments for competency. So we can see either one of those, and we can definitely see the kind of alliances that we would have thought would emerge only after the next election, we may see emerging shortly after the lockdown ends. So what does that mean for my clients? Meaning prosperous people who are on the whole of a more liberal persuasion, shall I say, and are typically the wrong color to be involved in radical economic transformation. The thing that I would say is, first of all, we have not exhausted opportunities in South Africa. South Africa will present a lot of business opportunities, and any new deal, whether it's a radical economic transformation situation or a much more liberal situation, will present lots of business opportunities. So I would say, first of all, don't forget that any change creates opportunities for people who grab the opportunities presented in those places. But the second thing is, it may become a country that is very unwelcoming to wealthy people. If you have a radical implementation of national health insurance, for instance, it may mean that you can no longer get good medical care in South Africa, etc., etc. So I think that it has become more urgent than ever to create optionality. So I'm not saying that the prospects for South Africa are dire necessarily. What I'm saying is the possibility of a government coming to power in South Africa that would be very unfriendly to wealthy people is much higher on the agenda than it's ever been. And much more, the possibility is much higher than it has been. And therefore, if you are in South Africa and you are a wealthy person, what should you be doing? So in our view, the first and most important thing is get some money offshore and make sure that you have the ability to have money offshore, so that, first of all, if you are in South Africa and a hyperinflation event takes place, that you are able to protect your wealth by having most of it or a large portion of it invested offshore. So that would be point number one. Point number two is to create the possibility for you and your family to actually go and live elsewhere. So things like citizenship programs and residency programs offshore become something that I think wealthy people should seriously consider. Not necessarily to go and live elsewhere, but to have the option to go and live elsewhere if the environment becomes very unfriendly. And then the last would be to say, if you are thinking about the future of your family, making sure that you have education opportunities and contacts in outside South Africa becomes ever more important, just because we must be ready to deal with the possibility that South Africa becomes a very unfriendly place for wealthy white people, if you want to put it that way. Wealthy people in general, but specifically white wealthy people might become a much more rare species. And that's not a rational response from the policymakers. The rational response would be to cultivate wealthy people because they are actually your tax base. But what we've seen is that populist projects worldwide are not really rational. And therefore, the idea that some very irrational policies might be implemented in South Africa should be seriously considered. So that's my hour of stuff on South African politics. I would, on the one hand, I think we are now at the point where we will be getting some guests who want to join on our weekly update on what's happening in markets and what's happening to the whole virus pandemic. So shall we maybe take a quick 1-minute break and wait for those people to come on board?
Thanks, Wikus. Pretty well, most of the people, I see Johan's just joined us and with his new glasses there in the picture. But the most of the people are on. So yes, have a quick cup of coffee and then we can begin, because as I say, I think this is the biggest attendance that we've had so far, and thanks to everybody who has joined us. I hope it's been meaningful. And just by the way, as usual, this Wikus's talk is being recorded, so you will be, the moment we've edited it and secured it, you will be sent a copy for future reference if that's of interest to you.
Okay, so maybe for those who have just joined again, the convention is to turn your camera and your sound off unless you want to say something or ask a question. And so that's point number one, just as a practical matter, because it gives better connectivity. Yuan, you're the one person I think we can see on our screens. If you can just turn your camera off, please, that would be better. There's still someone
else. Yes, I think that's Mark. I think that's Mark who's probably just fainted or something. And we're seeing all of these fancy files.
Yeah, we're seeing the fancy files.
That's not me, Lee.
Okay, Mark. Sorry. I'm against the Banana Boys today.
Yeah, shame. So, Reese, if you could turn your camera off, that would also be useful. Unless you wanted to give us some comment or ask a question, which you're obviously welcome to do. Again, just for everybody who's just joined, nothing we say here should be construed as advice. Advice we'll give in written form to individuals. This is just my opinion. So maybe a quick update on what's happening on the coronavirus front. So the main thing that we see worldwide in terms of the coronavirus thing is that we are seeing lockdown fatigue. So what's happening is a large part of the world is still under some form of lockdown, but virtually everywhere in the world, whether they are seeing a reduction in infections and deaths or not, there seems to be a great urgency to moving on from the lockdown. And we believe that a significant portion of that lockdown fatigue is just because people's financial and emotional resources have been exhausted, and therefore a lot of businesses are in the process of failing. A lot of individuals in many countries are getting hungry. In South Africa, we are hearing about malnutrition presenting at hospitals for the first time in decades. So there is a massive amount of lockdown fatigue appearing worldwide. So that would be my first observation about the virus, is that people are moving on from lockdown. And it's kind of in many cases a ready or not thing. Reese, if you could turn your camera off, that would be great. There we go. Thank you very much. So that's point number one. The second point observation I would want to make about the virus is we are now clearly seeing a massive increase in cases in South Africa. So the South African epidemic is really gathering steam, especially in the Western Cape. And I see that the latest projection now is that we are likely to see at least 40,000 deaths from coronavirus in South Africa. Now, again, my own observation for a while has been that the emotional content of the South African situation will change radically over the next 2 months. The emotional content of it was, I dislike being locked down. That's been the main issue, and I'm getting fed up with lockdown. And there are some irrational lockdown things, to being, I'm really scared to go out of my house because everybody out there has coronavirus and a lot of people are dying. That's likely to be the emotional content 2 months from now. But in South Africa as well, we've seen that even though we've had one of the hardest forms of lockdown in the world, we could not contain the virus completely, and we still saw the gradual spread of the virus, and that spread is now accelerating. And obviously, the more we open up, the faster the spread will be. But the third observation I'd like to make about the virus is that a lot of countries in the world, and I include South Africa in that, is now at risk of having the worst of both worlds, meaning locking down and destroying their economy and then opening up too soon and having a real epidemic with lots of deaths and massive pressure on the health systems as well. So it's not clear that the current policies will have the desired effect really in very many places in the world. So just to get back to the policy response and the likely outcomes, there are basically two ways in which you can deal with this virus. The one is, if you are a developed country, you can lock down, get the virus under control, but under control doesn't mean kind of fairly widespread but not increasing anymore. Under control means very few cases that you can actually track and trace, and where you can keep the virus under you keep your level of infection very low. So countries like China and South Korea and New Zealand are examples of countries where they've effectively come very close to eradicating the virus, and they're just now trying to keep the virus out of their population, and they will keep to that lockdown level, let's just say lockdown level 2, if you want, until a cure or a vaccine is found. So that's the one approach that makes sense. The other approach, and that's the approach that you're likely to have if you are a developing country, where we know that you can't actually maintain the kind of lockdown that's necessary to come close to eradicating the virus. So this would be places like India, South Africa, Brazil, etc. So by the way, Brazil is now the country with the third most infections in the world. So number 1 is the USA, number 2 is Russia, and number 3 is Brazil. In those third world countries, because you don't actually have any chance of eradicating or coming close to eradicating the virus, really having very low levels of infection, what you want to do is to just actually get yourself prepared in terms of your health system, and then allow the economy at least to go back to reasonable levels of activity, so that you don't get poverty-related deaths compounding the coronavirus-related deaths. So effectively, if you're thinking about the South African situation, if we had a 2 to 3 week initial hard lockdown and we prepared our hospitals to deal with coronavirus cases and then pretty much opened the economy up, that would have been a rational response. Anything in between is really irrational. So locking down hard for a while and then opening up, pretty much what's happening in the US, is not a rational response. You should either lock down hard and keep at it, or you should be much more relaxed and keep at it. So the rational responders would be New Zealand, China, and South Korea on the hard lockdown side, or the Swedens and Hollands, and maybe even the Brazils of the world, where you have a much more relaxed attitude from day one, and where you actually try to maintain a much higher level of economic activity while you allow the virus to spread through your population and you allow herd immunity to build up. Anything halfway really seems to me to be an invitation to get the worst of both worlds. So in Britain, for instance, you had a quite severe epidemic and massive economic disruption. And if you open up too quickly now, you might actually see a recurrence in many of these developed countries that open up too soon. So, very interesting. the other interesting thing is we are seeing the stats coming through for the economics side of things, which says that economies were, as expected, devastated by the coronavirus epidemic. And it looks like for the third quarter of the year, most developed economies in the world will report somewhere between minus 20 and minus 30% GDP growth. So the economic effects has been as severe as we expected, but many of those places are now going back to some form of lesser lockdown. So very few places in the world are they opening up completely. So travel restrictions, restrictions on restaurants, on hotels, etc., likely to remain in most places. But on the other hand, most places are moving towards opening up schools, allowing some religious gatherings, etc. So pretty much the world is moving away from the 70% economy that we saw in the severe phase of lockdown towards the 90% economy, which is the next phase of lockdown. So that's just in terms of where the world is going. We suspect that in many places, including the United States, we'll see the recurrence of much more severe epidemics. And it would be interesting to see whether they go back into the very strict forms of lockdown, or whether the opposition to lockdown that comes from economic participants have strengthened to the level where even with very severe epidemics, there won't be lockdown. My suspicion is that most developed countries will go back into some fairly strict form of lockdown, even if it's localized, if they get recurrences of the epidemics. So it's likely in the US, for instance, that in states that haven't been that severely affected up to now, we'll see the much more intensive epidemics over the next couple of months, and that those states will then lock down quite severely again. But the states who have had the epidemic may actually have lesser forms of lockdown. So we actually think that there will be incidences of lockdown, but that the general level of lockdown around the world we've seen in the second quarter of the year, meaning from April to June, we won't see that coming back. We'll see a much lower level of lockdown, but that lower level of lockdown is likely to be sustained roughly to the end of the year. There will be incidences where people will make a big fuss about having an effective vaccine. Very unlikely that an effective vaccine will be widely available before next year. So we're likely to see the 90% economy sustained through most of this year and into early next year. And if we're really lucky, we might see a generally available vaccine worldwide by the middle of next year. So again, my own view of a place like South Africa and Brazil is that we will have fairly quick, very severe epidemics, and then emerge on the other side of those epidemics into what would still be some kind of 90% economy, because your interaction with the rest of the world will still be heavily curtailed. So even if I'm right, in South Africa, we see a very severe epidemic peaking somewhere around August, most likely. And by November, we pretty much open up because there's herd immunity in the South African population. The economy on the other side of this is likely to also still be a severely curtailed economy. And what you're also likely to see is that even though the formal regulations may be relaxed, people's own behavior during an epidemic will contribute to much slower growth, much less than you would expect just from the regulations. It's not clear to me in terms of the South African government's response whether they have made peace with the fact that they can't contain the epidemic and that they really just need to do what they originally set out to do, which is to prepare the medical fraternity for the epidemic and then let the epidemic come and go, or whether they will try to contain the spread of the virus through various stricter lockdowns in specific areas. Not 100% clear to me. At this point, it would be very interesting to see what happens. There seems to be a move to take the rest of the country to level 3, but there's now a debate about whether the Western Cape, where by far the largest number of cases have been reported, whether the Western Cape should remain in lockdown level 4 or even go back to lockdown level 5. So we've seen the ANC in the Western Cape saying the Western Cape should go back to level 5. We've seen the DA, who's the actual government in the Western Cape, saying that they are ready to move to level 3. So it will be very interesting to see how that plays out. But the rational response is to have less lockdown, because the harm coming from lockdown is starting to exceed the harm coming from the virus in many ways, and that we are actually unable to contain the harm that comes from the virus anyway. So therefore, better to not have the worst of both worlds, the economic harm and the harm from the epidemic. In terms of markets, it's interesting that we've continued to see actually quite strong equity markets worldwide. And especially this week, we've seen quite a strong bounce back when the first inkling of a successful vaccine was seen. So I see that yesterday, the company that announced the vaccine, their stock price came back quite a bit, because once people started looking at the actual figures, it was much less promising than the initial press releases had indicated. But we've seen markets being quite strong, and we still see the maintenance of the view in the markets that we will see a V-shaped recovery, meaning that economic activity will return to where it was before the virus struck very quickly. At the same time, we see economists, and many of the economists in the government, in fact, saying that it will take a very long time for the economy to go back to where it was before. So very few people are saying that 2021 will see an economy that was as strong as 2019. So the earliest that economists are really talking about is that 2023 might be the year where the world economy gets back to the level of activity that we had in 2019. And in fact, if you read the serious economists, most of them are saying that it return to the levels of activity of 2019 is unlikely to happen before 2025. So why are economists so gloomy? Let me go back to that argument. And the basic argument is that if you think about the three groups participating in the economy, all three of them will appear at the other side of this epidemic in much worse financial shape in terms of their balance sheets than they entered it. So let's go through those three groups quickly. The first group being consumers, and a large number of consumers will have had their incomes radically curtailed worldwide. So we are seeing some aid reaching portions of the groups who have lost their jobs. So in the US, we're likely to see the jobless rate rise to close on 20%, most likely, but a very large portion of that 20% will be receiving some form of government aid that helps them to navigate through the downturn. So in fact, the pressure to open up is not coming from labor. They're quite happy to say, I'd rather be safe in my home and getting a government subsidy than to go back to work and get a salary but be exposed to the virus. So the pressure for opening up coming from other sectors, and that sector mostly being business. So around the world, if you think about it, consumers will come out the other side with their balance sheets severely curtailed, meaning they will have used up a large portion of their cash, they will have taken up some credit facilities, and they will be very keen participants as producers, but not very keen participants as consumers. So it's unlikely that consumer sentiment will be strong. In fact, consumer confidence are likely to be very low on the other side of this, and we're seeing that already in China, where they're opening up, but consumers are not participating to the same extent as spenders as they were before. The second sector then being business. Businesses are seeing their balance sheets destroyed as well. So they are maintaining their overheads, but they're not making any profit on the whole, except for a small group of companies. Therefore, businesses will not participate as investors keenly at the back end of this. So the whole idea that business confidence will be strong afterwards, very unlikely to happen. You're likely to emerge at the back end of this with very low business confidence, meaning private sector investment will be very low. And we're also seeing lots of speculation about the levels of debt being accumulated by governments. So to give you an idea of what's happening, most countries, India, for instance, South Africa is another instance, have announced stimulus packages or relief packages, whichever you want to call it. At the moment, more likely to be relief packages because it's just relief to people who are forced to stay at home, of roughly 10% of GDP. So that's the one half of it. The other half of it is that governments are typically losing about a third of their tax revenue, meaning that they are losing another 10% of GDP in unpaid taxes. So government debt is likely to rise by about 20% of GDP in this fiscal year alone, meaning that for a country like South Africa, which was in the mid-50s, we go from the mid-50s into the mid-70s in this year alone. And then afterwards, for at least 2 years, if the economy doesn't bounce back immediately, South Africa is likely to end up with more than 100% of GDP as government debt, which used to be regarded as extremely high. So if you think of Italy, Italy went into this with 120% of GDP of government debt. They're likely to come out on the other side with something close on 200% of GDP of government debt. So governments will also have to find some way over the next decade to reduce their net debt. So even though economies, in order to bounce back because of the low business confidence and the low consumer confidence, will need a lot of stimulation, we're unlikely to see that. It will be difficult for governments to reduce their debt and provide sufficient stimulus. So we'll see how that actually eventuates. Stock markets, however, have been very impressed with the amount of liquidity created by central banks and the amount of stimulus being put into the economy by governments. And therefore, stock markets are not that much lower than they were before. So our view is that surely it's very unlikely that stock markets should be much higher than they were before this happened, except for maybe the tech sector, because this may have been an event that pushes the tech sector forward. So it may be that once we get through recovery, companies like Amazon's prices should be higher. Not necessarily, but it may be. But for most of the rest of the economy will be slow and profits will be significantly lower. Because also there are various interruptions to supply chains, and it's actually much more expensive to produce while maintaining social distancing, etc. So profits will come under a great deal of pressure. So we think that stock markets are still likely at some point to be affected by the realism of the fact that profits will be a lot lower for a long time. So we don't really think that the risk-return proposition in shares worldwide is very attractive at this moment. So we're staying away. At the same time, we are seeing that there seems to be the complete panic in emerging market government bonds have passed. So we're seeing, for instance, the rates on South African government bonds, long-term government bonds, starting to come down. So there's some profits have been taken and some profits still to be had in investing into government bonds in emerging markets. And we're also still seeing that emerging market currencies are quite weak. So you'll see the rand being quite stable, somewhere between 18 and 19 rand to the dollar. In our view, way too weak. So again, our view is that there's no reason to believe that the exchange rates of developing countries should be a lot lower because of this pandemic than before, because we don't think that relative to developed countries will be worse affected. Yes, the epidemics will be deeper and faster in the developing countries than in the developed countries. But what we would say is that from an economic point of view, the epidemic is unlikely to have, from a health perspective and from a structural perspective, long-lasting negative effects. Because the people dying are mostly old people who are not participants in the economy and are actually people who receive pensions and subsidies. So once you look back at it 2-3 years from now, you're not going to say, wow, we don't have the necessary employees because of the fact that the coronavirus actually meant that too many of them died. That's unlikely to happen. What is likely to happen roughly 20 years from now in places like Australia is you'll have a whole generation that was schooled at home by alcoholics. And therefore, there's likely to be some inconsistency in policy making 20 years from now. But it's unlikely to have long-lasting economic effects. And therefore, we think that the idea that emerging markets should be much more affected than developed markets, we think is wrong. We think that will correct itself. So we think that the real opportunity in markets is to be investing into developing markets and pretty much the government bonds in those developing markets. But we also think that it behoves us to have large amounts of cash in our portfolios, just because the risk-reward in shares seems to be unappetizing, although there's likely to be a bounce back once we get to fully open or more fully open economies and a more dependable vaccine. We think that will be short term, because the real severe effects are the balance sheet effects, and we think that will keep economies under strain for 2 to 3 years more. So we think there will be much better times to buy into shares than we are seeing right now. We are 1 minute past our time. I will stand pat and take questions or comments.
Thanks, Wikus. The first question is in terms of the one thing that Classic does is with its clients is put following distance into investments. Perhaps you could just elaborate on that, because that caters for what you've been saying in terms of how long it's going to take for the equity markets to start picking up again.
So I guess the first thing that we would say is that for Classic Wealth clients, this whole crisis has not been a very worrying thing, because they've been protected from this by two issues. The one is that we always believe in following distance, meaning we want to be able to weather a 6-year downturn in markets in our clients' portfolio. So we want our clients to be in a position where they never need to draw from their investments for at least 6 years. So all our clients had plenty of following distance in place, and therefore can weather the storm in the first place. The second issue is that our clients had very well diversified portfolios, and therefore, even when equity markets turned down in March, their portfolios were not very negatively affected just because of the fact that they had other assets in there as well. And then we've taken a view that even for those clients with significant equity exposure, we've reduced that exposure just because our view of the risk-return trade-off is quite negative. But so from our point of view, our clients are in quite a good position. And what we would say is that actually, in terms of both the politics that we discussed in the first hour and the whole question of the virus that we've discussed in the last half an hour, by far the most important thing is what is your situation rather than what is going on out there. So if you prepare your situation to deal with potential negative events from time to time, remember that Anton Rupert said that those who do not believe in miracles are not realists. And we think that is true. There are some fantastic things that happen from time to time, and one should be able to take advantage of those fantastic things. But there are also terrible things that happen from time to time, and you should gear yourself to be, for you and your portfolio, to be resistant to those terrible events, especially if they are localized. So we basically have a belief that very good financial planning, making sure there's enough cash in your portfolio to tide you through periods of difficulty, and then having a very diversified portfolio, meaning, South Africa is only 1% of the world's listed assets, that you can't really get very diversified in South Africa. Diversified portfolio, and that makes you much more resistant to negative events in the future. So our clients on the whole are people who have made money and want to make sure they keep it, rather than people who want to get wealthy overnight. And we think that that's the right way to go about it. Make sure you plan properly, make sure that you're very diversified.
Great, thanks. Are there any other questions?
Lee, it's Keith here. I just wanted to, if I may just say to Wikus, thank you very much for your political analysis. Very useful, and especially the three factions within the NEC. But I think that's really the issue that's on everybody's minds is what happens next, and can Cyril Ramaphosa control the process? And he's in a very, very difficult situation, which obviously is what you referred to, that he's this, you could liken him to being the CEO of a very dynamic company. The only problem is the CEO of a dynamic company, 50.1 beats 49.9, and the 49.9, if they don't like the 50.1, they can't hijack the entity. And he's trying to be a CEO where he doesn't actually have control of the majority vote necessarily. And on your analysis with the NEC, the 40 people, he doesn't even have the support necessarily of the majority of his shareholders. So he's in a very, very difficult position, and he has to go very carefully. Otherwise he can, as you say, overnight we could certainly find that he's no longer there. And if he's no longer there, who knows who will be there. But the other interesting thing, of course, is that despite his long business career, I'm not sure that Cyril's ever been CEO of any operating company. And it's difficult for him to have to control all these different forces and come up with consensus and then act it out when you know that even though you've achieved a substantial consensus, there are still people in the minority who, and they may be a small minority percentage-wise, but they've got vast political power. So I think we all have to really just understand the difficult situation that he's in.
Yeah, Keith, thank you very much. I think that very much aligns to my thinking. But
yeah.
in my view, what you have to say is that what do we do about this? And the thing that we need to do about this is to say, how do we reduce the risk that would be posed to us by a negative outcome out of this? That's the first thing, because it seems to me that a quite radically negative outcome has become much more possible in the last 5 years than we would have imagined before. That's the one half of it. The other half of it is to not get so focused on the potential negative outcome that we lose sight of the opportunities presented by a possible positive outcome, and even the opportunities that present itself in a negative outcome. So for most of us, the best opportunity to make money is still inside South Africa, because we know the circumstances and the people better than we know anything else. At the same time, I would say to you that preserving your wealth is much better done outside South Africa than inside South Africa, and much better done with a very wide diversification than a concentrated investment into anything, no matter how confident you are of that one specific thing.
Mm-hmm. Yep. Thank you.
Great. Thanks.